Member for Regina, West Canada.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's an honor to have the opportunity to rise virtually in this chamber to participate in tonight's debate. Madam Speaker, I have the privilege of serving on the House of Commons Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities with an outstanding group of MPs from all parties. Over the course of the past several months, the committee had the opportunity to hear from many different representatives from the country's air travel sector. Yesterday, the committee presented to the House its report titled Emerging from the Crisis, a study of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the air transport sector. Madam Speaker, the committee witnesses were unanimous in their bleak assessment of the effects of the pandemic on air travel. Few sectors have been hit harder by the pandemic than the air travel sector. Airlines, airports, independent travel advisors, air traffic controllers, small business owners who run the souvenir shops at the airports, they have all experienced job losses, cutbacks, and hardship. But unlike many sectors, restarting the air travel sector will not be like turning on a light switch. The air travel sector has faced many unique challenges during the pandemic, the effects of which will be felt for years to come. For this evening's debate, I will focus my remarks on the difficult situation in which Canada's airports find themselves. Madam Speaker, the air travel sector cannot function without financially viable airports. After all, the airplanes have to have some place to land and some place to take off from. When most of this country's airports were privatized in the 1990s, a fee structure was established with the airlines that was based on air traffic volumes. This country's airports could rely on a steady stream of revenues as long as there was also a steady stream of commercial airline flights. Madam Speaker, all of that came to a halt in the spring of 2020 at the start of the pandemic. In my home city of Regina, the Regina International Airport went 10 days at the beginning of the pandemic without a single commercial passenger flight. 10 days, Madam Speaker. For much of the pandemic, air travel levels were down as much as 90% compared to pre-pandemic levels. This lack of air travel means a lack of revenue for this country's airports. As a result, airports had to lay off staff and dip into cash reserves. When the cash reserves ran out, they had to go to the bank and borrow. Today, Madam Speaker, this country's airports have debt loads that they have never seen before. And how will they pay off this debt? By passing the costs on to consumers as air travel resumes after the pandemic. Now, some people may shrug their shoulders and say, so what? So airport debts and debt servicing fees get passed on to air travelers. That's life. And maybe it wouldn't be such a big deal if Canada were a closed country that lived in isolation. But we're not. Air travel policies of the American government are bound to affect Canada and the rest of the world as well. So it's worth noting that within weeks of the start of the pandemic, the US Congress passed the CARES Act to provide $10 billion in financial relief to American airports. This means that American airports have had financial certainty throughout the pandemic and haven't had to go deep into debt. This means that American airports will not have the financial burden of debt and debt servicing costs to pass on to their customers. Even before the pandemic, flying out of a Canadian airport was significantly more expensive than flying out of an American one. This is because historically, American governments have viewed airports as an infrastructure investment. While in Canada, most airports operate on Crown land and serve as a source of revenue for the federal government through ground lease payments. And so as Canadian airports take on more and more debt and pass more and more debt and debt servicing costs onto passengers, American airports become relatively less expensive by comparison. This poses a real long-term problem for Canadian airports, especially those that are located within driving distance of the US border. Bellingham, Washington's airport is just a short drive across the border from Vancouver. Niagara Falls Airport is on the American side of the border, just a short drive down the highway from Hamilton and St. Catharines. The airport in Plattsburgh, New York, already advertises itself as Montreal's US airport. And all along the Canada-US border, the story is the same. American airports will become more attractive options as Canadian airports struggle to find ways to pass on their crippling debt loads onto Canadian travelers. These debt loads will have a ripple effect across the air travel sector as Canadian airlines, independent travel advisors, and hotels lose business across the border. So, Madam Speaker, what can the government do to help this country's struggling airports? I would say that one thing that the air travel sector really needs right now is a safe reopening plan. You see, the quicker we can get Canadians flying again, the quicker airline and airport revenues will rebound, and all of the harmful effects of the pandemic that I have described can be minimized. But the biggest challenge facing the air travel sector is a lack of customers caused by uncertainty in the marketplace. The pandemic has thrown many sectors of the economy into chaos. Restaurants, movie theaters, clothing stores, you name it. But most businesses are primarily governed by their provincial governments, and most provincial governments have already spelled out a safe reopening plan based on vaccination levels. For example, in my home province of Saskatchewan, in just 3 more days, restaurants will no longer have to limit the number of customers seated at a single table. But customers will only be able to order a la carte. Buffets are still not allowed yet. Just think of how much easier it is for restaurant workers and owners and their customers to plan a major dinner party when there is a clearly spelled out reopening plan for restaurants. Now imagine if the federal government were to do the same thing for air travel. I'm sure that after well over a year of this pandemic, many Canadians would really like to start making their summer travel plans. Airlines, travel advisors, tour operators, and hotels would all like to start making bookings. But what are the rules? And more importantly, what will the rules be next week and next month and in the coming months as vaccination levels continue to inch upwards? If someone who is fully vaccinated flies down to the States and then flies back, how much longer will that person still have to go through the mandatory 14-day quarantine? How much longer will that person still have to go to the quarantine hotels? What about someone who is only partially vaccinated? What about a husband and wife who are fully vaccinated, but their children are too young to receive the vaccine? And that's just for international travel. What about traveling within Canada? Are we going to see a patchwork of different rules within Canada where some provinces require quarantines and others do not? Will it be easier for Canadians to fly to the United States for their summer holidays than to other provinces within Canada? These are all very reasonable and practical questions that Canadians are starting to ask. The absence of any answers and the absence of any safe reopening plan from the federal government is putting another summer travel season in jeopardy. The loss of another summer travel season would cause undue harm not only to this country's airports, but to our airlines, independent travel advisors, air traffic controllers, tour operators, and so many Canadians who depend on a properly functioning air transport sector. I call on the government to present as soon as possible a safe reopening plan for air travel. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Jean. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his presentation. I listened to it closely because I have an airport in my riding. Well, it's a rather small one, but it's big enough to have an air traffic control tower. And we saw during the pandemic, given the fact that air traffic became far more sparse, NAVCAN reduced services in air traffic control towers, and it's very difficult to have a recovery in that sector because it's difficult to train air traffic controllers. So I'd like to hear what my colleague has to say on the following. Was it a good idea to delay closing air traffic control towers to see how the pandemic was going? And if in general, is this something that we should maintain, these traffic control towers?
Regina Wascana.
Well, I would like to thank the honourable member for her question, and some of the vocabulary is a little bit technical, so I'm going to respond in English. Well, it is my hope that this is not just a delay in the closing of these air traffic control towers. It is my hope that once air travel resumes to normal level, there won't be a need to close these towers at all, and that life will be back to normal and Canadians will be flying again, and there will be no need for layoffs at NAV Canada. I would encourage the honourable member to read the report that was tabled in the House yesterday. One of the themes of the report and one of the recommendations is the need for alternative funding models for not just NAV Canada, but air travel in general during the times of a pandemic. I think that the funding model for NAV Canada has worked very well for the first quarter century of NAV Canada's existence, but when a pandemic hits, everything becomes quite topsy-turvy. We have a social safety net in place for workers in the form of employment insurance and workers' compensation and that sort of thing. Maybe we need a self-funding social safety net for NAV Canada where they could draw.
Unfortunately, I do have to allow for other questions. I ask the honourable member to keep his responses to a minute. Questions and comments, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, understanding the importance of our airports in all regions of the country is something in which this government has, in fact, demonstrated quite clearly. There is major economic and social benefits, whether it's an international airport or a local airport, no matter what the size of the airport is, and these facilities and the role that they play in the communities. There's no question about that. The concern I have in regard, and the government has been there to be able to support them in very tangible ways. The question that I have for my friend is that he seems to think that Canada, with the vast country it is, that all we need to be able to do is say, here is a date. And this is the day in which you can allow files. We don't necessarily have to listen to the healthcare professionals or the science. Does he not recognize second waves, third waves, that we need to listen to healthcare professionals and science?
The honourable member for Regina, West Canada.
Yes, well, thank you to the honourable member for his question. And Madam Speaker, I will try to keep it a bit shorter this time. I would say that it would be foolish to pick a date on the calendar at random and say that that is the date of the reopening. I would say that we need to have a comprehensive plan that is built in consultation with our medical professionals. And I think that what the federal government should be doing is to follow the lead of many provincial governments, which is to come up with a minimum level of vaccinations that makes a safe reopening plan reasonable, and then look at the calendar and say, based on our current levels of vaccination and the current rates of vaccination, what would be a reasonable time frame to achieve those goals so that Canadians can start making their summer travel plans and we can get Canadians working again and life back to normal. So I thank the honourable member for his question.
We may have time for a very brief question. L'honorable député de Avignon.
The honourable member for Avignon-la-Métis, Matane-la-Matapédia. I'm going to stay in the aviation sector. In the Bloc Québécois, we believe that when big airline companies receive public subsidies, well, it's perfectly logical for them to reimburse customers for an unrendered service. And the MP for Pierre Boucher, Les Patriotes Verchères, saw his bill supported by the Transport Committee so that MPs could adopt it rapidly. So I'd like to hear when we'll have the opportunity to vote on this bill. Will my colleague be for this bill?
Member for Regina, West Canada.
I would like to thank the honourable member for a question. And yes, I am certainly in favour of the principle of refunds for air passengers who have paid for a service that they have not yet received. I will have to admit to the honourable member, I have not yet read that particular bill in full, but I will certainly read it with interest. Thank you.